Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Belknap, and I am here to talk to you about some more of 6E, Standard 6E, U.S. Virginia history. So you have looked at sectionalism now. Remember, sectionalism is feeling pride in your section. So in this time period, people who lived in the South felt more pride about being a Southerner than they felt about being an American. The same goes for the North. People identified more with their section of the country, North, South, or West, than they did with the nation as a whole. Okay. You also did some maps to show the attempted compromises over Western territories. And this video is going to help you to explain how debates over states' rights increased tensions between the sections. Remember that states' rights meant that people, if someone believed in states' rights, they believed that the state government should have more power than the federal government. And after this video, you should also have a better understanding of how debates over the institution of slavery increased tensions between the North and the South. We're going to get into 6G as well, which is the last part of Standard 6. And by the end of this, you should be able to understand the Northern and Southern reaction to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and analyze the Dred Scott decision, which was a Supreme Court case from the 1850s. Here we go. All right, so here is the essential understanding from Standard 6E on sectionalism, that the growing divisions over slavery and states' rights continued to split the nation apart. So as the United States expanded westward, the conflict over slavery grew more bitter, which means angry, and threatened to tear the country apart. And people called abolitionists wanted to abolish slavery. So an abolitionist is somebody who was anti-slavery. They did not want slavery. To abolish means to end something. What they wanted to end was slavery. Right, here's our first individual. His name is William Lloyd Garrison. He was part of the growing abolitionist movement in the North. He was one of the leaders of this movement. Okay, he published a newspaper called The Liberator. Liberator has at its root the idea of liberty, which is freedom. So in his newspaper, he published articles about why the slaves should be freed. Many New England religious leaders read his paper and believed slavery was a violation of Christian principles. So they would also work with him to try to get laws passed to end slavery in the United States. Here you see Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's also hanging on our classroom wall. You can look around to find her. She is most famous for writing the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is pictured here. This was an advertisement for the book, actually. She was the wife of a New England clergyman. When she wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, she wrote it after the fugitive slave law was written in 1850. She was very upset about the fact that people could be arrested for trying to help slaves to escape, and she wanted to let people know more about what the life of slaves was like. And that's what her book was about, what the lives of the slaves were like. It sold over 300,000 copies, and because of it, more people in the North joined abolitionist groups. So it was a bestseller in the North. People are reading it. Once they read it, they want to help to end slavery, so they join abolitionist groups. And then in the South, people are scared by the fact that abolitionism was gaining in strength, that more people were becoming abolitionists. And so in a lot of southern states, you could not buy the book. That's how scared they were about it. All right, next we have Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a slave who lived in Virginia. And as a slave in Virginia, he led a revolt. This revolt resulted in many whites in his neighborhood being killed, which fed white Southern fears about slave rebellions. This then led to harsh laws in the South against fugitive slaves. These laws are called the slave codes. A code is just another word for a law. Southerners who once favored abolition were scared into silence because of Nat Turner's rebellion. Next, we have Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was also a former slave. She escaped to freedom in the North, but she didn't live out her life in the North. Instead, she became part of a system called the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was not a real railroad. It did not have tracks with trains that ran on it. Instead, it was just the term for this series of routes that people would take to escape from slavery in the South into the North and then later into Canada. So before 1850, a person could escape along the Underground Railroad and then attain freedom in the North. But after 1850, people were required to return slaves that were thought to be runaways, and if you didn't, then you could be arrested. And so that would make the Underground Railroad have to go then all the way to Canada, because once people were in Canada, they were not in the United States anymore, and they could not be returned to their former owners. And here you see Frederick Douglass. We heard about him in the video that we watched about this time period. He was a runaway slave. He gained his freedom. Once he gained his freedom after running away, he became a very prominent speaker. So he would go around the North and give speeches about why slavery needed to end. He would help people to understand how terrible it was for the people that were slaves and help to raise money to try and end slavery. He also published a newspaper called the North Star. The North Star was a symbol of the Underground Railroad because that's what people would follow to go to the North. One of the more radical abolitionists is this man here, John Brown. John Brown was one of the most extreme or fanatical abolitionists. He was responsible for killing some pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, people who wanted to have slavery in Kansas moved to Kansas. People who did not want there to be slavery in Kansas moved to Kansas. John Brown, who did not want slavery, led an attack against people who did have slaves in that state of Kansas. Later, he tried to start a slave rebellion in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He was caught during that event and later put to death for trying to bring about that rebellion. Right, next you see Dred Scott. He's the one I mentioned earlier, would go to the Supreme Court. So Dred Scott was a slave. His master was an army surgeon. They moved to the Northwest in both Wisconsin and Illinois, which were free territories. Because they had lived in a free territory, he sued for his freedom. That means he was asking the court to say he is free because he lived in a free territory. This case is called Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Supreme Court ruled two important things. One, slaves are not citizens, and therefore he couldn't be in court. Two, Congress could make no laws regarding slavery anywhere in the United States, and that the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery north of the 3630 line, was unconstitutional. So these two things make abolitionists really angry. Number one, that they're saying that slaves are not citizens. That makes them mad because we believe that all people are born with the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And number two, that Congress isn't going to be able to pass any laws to get rid of slavery makes them very angry. That brings us to Abraham Lincoln. He was somebody who opposed slavery, and he is very upset by the Dred Scott decision. So he will run for Senate in 1858 as a Republican in Illinois. He lost that election, but because of how much he was written about in the newspapers during that election, he got very famous in the United States. He ran for president in 1860 and was elected, and that's where we're going to end Standard 6 for now. Okay, just one more thing. One of the things that Lincoln is most known for as saying when he accepted the nomination to run for Senate was, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. The nation cannot continue half slave and half free." So with that, he was saying that he understood that something was going to have to happen about slavery. Either it was going to have to end, or the nation was going to have to divide into the two sections, North and South. Okay, let us know if you have any questions.